The arrest. Jesus had withdrawn from the camp with John, James, and Peter to pray. They had walked through a small ravine, right up to the bivouac where the disciples and a group of faithful Greeks had pitched their tents. There in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus endured one of the most dreadful moments of his earthly life. But his human nature gloriously triumphed when at last it fully surrendered to God, as he had expressed in the triple prayer, while his weary apostles slept the sleep of physical exhaustion. After Jesus woke his 3 apostles for the last time, he suggested they return to their tents to sleep. But suddenly, they heard someone approaching. Out of the darkness, they saw 2 men, and when they came close, they recognized them as messengers of David Zebedee. The messengers seemed hurried and excitedly asked where David was. Peter told them that David was keeping watch in the apostles' camp, and they hurried on. They didn't take the path through the ravine toward the camp, but instead walked above it, cutting through the bivouac of the disciples. A Greek on watch sensed trouble and raised the alarm. Everyone in the camp woke up and came out of their tents armed. A chaotic situation arose, but after the messengers identified themselves, everyone calmed down. The messengers continued on to David, and Jesus kindly urged his disciples and the Greeks to return to their tents, but they hesitated to obey his request. When Jesus noticed that his followers were not returning to their tents, he left them. He descended to the road and took a seat on an olive press near the entrance of the Garden of Gethsemane. The 3 apostles and the other followers saw him walk away into the night, and they hesitated to follow him. Only the young John Mark slipped unseen behind Jesus. When he saw that Jesus had seated himself on the olive press, he hid in a shed less than 15 meters from Jesus. Jesus had withdrawn from the camp and his followers because his divine nature knew that the soldiers who were coming to arrest him were approaching. By leaving, he hoped to avoid a confrontation between his followers and the soldiers. Jesus actually wanted his apostles not to witness the arrest because he feared that the sight of Judas would provoke their desire for revenge, potentially leading to a bloodbath. Jesus feared that if they were arrested with him, they might also perish with him. Although Jesus knew that the plan to execute him had been devised in the councils of the Jewish leaders, he was also aware that all these wicked plans had the full approval of Lucifer and Satan. And he knew all too well that these spiritual rebels would take pleasure if they could also execute all the apostles with him. Jesus was now alone, and he saw the lanterns of his enemies approaching. He decided to stop and sat on an olive press, where he awaited the arrival of his betrayer. At this moment, he was seen only by John Mark and a countless host of heavenly spectators. As the armed soldiers and temple guards with their torches and lanterns approached the garden, Judas hurried forward so that he was alone in front, intending to identify Jesus quickly. He hoped that the soldiers would arrest Jesus swiftly before his followers could organize to defend him. But this plan was thwarted because, when they reached the entrance of the garden, they saw a figure sitting on the olive press. 300 meters away, Peter, James, and John, along with about 30 other disciples and faithful Greeks, suddenly saw the burning torches emerge from behind a ridge, and they immediately realized that these were soldiers coming to arrest Jesus. They all rushed down the hill to the spot of the olive press, where the master sat alone in the moonlight. While the platoon of soldiers approached from one side, his followers came running from the other. The 2 groups stopped and took positions facing each other. Jesus was between them, and Judas stood before him, about to plant the traitorous kiss on his forehead. Before Judas could reach Jesus, Jesus stepped aside and addressed the Roman soldiers, asking, "Who are you looking for?" The captain replied, "Jesus of Nazareth." Then Jesus turned to the officer standing before him and spoke with the calm and majestic voice of the God of this entire creation. "That is me." As if pushed by an invisible hand, the entire group of soldiers recoiled. They were more than surprised by the calm and majestic manner in which Jesus revealed himself. For a moment there was a standstill. The soldiers on one side, his followers, many with drawn swords, about 15 meters away on the other side, with Jesus and Judas in the middle. Judas no longer needed to betray Jesus because Jesus had already revealed himself. However, the betrayer had to do something to explain his presence with this armed group. He saw Jesus' armed followers and realized that he was standing in a very dangerous place next to Jesus. He was very afraid that the apostles would concentrate an attack on him in retaliation for betraying their beloved teacher. As the guards quickly recovered from their inexplicable hesitation, Judas approached Jesus, kissed him on his forehead, and said, "Hail, Master and Teacher." As Judas embraced his master in this way, Jesus said, "Friend, isn't it enough to do this? Do you really want to betray the Son of Man with a kiss?" The apostles, disciples, and the Greeks were literally stunned by what they saw. For a moment, no one moved. Then Jesus freed himself from the traitorous embrace of Judas, walked up to the temple guards and soldiers, and again asked, "Who are you looking for?" And again the captain said, "Jesus of Nazareth." And once more Jesus answered, "I have told you that I am he. If it is me you seek, let these others go their way. I am ready to go with you." Jesus was willing to let himself be arrested, and the captain of the soldiers was entirely prepared to let his followers go their way in peace. However, before the captain could give an order, a certain Malchus, a notorious Syrian bodyguard of the high priest, stepped out of the line and walked around Jesus to bind his hands behind his back. He did this entirely on his own initiative and, out of sheer stupidity, turned his back on the followers of Jesus. The Roman captain had not given such an order. When Peter and his companions saw that their master was being grabbed from behind by Malchus, they could no longer contain themselves. Peter drew his sword and, along with the others, rushed forward to attack Malchus. Before the soldiers or the temple guards could come to Malchus's aid, Jesus forcefully pushed Malchus aside and stepped between him and his charging followers. With a prohibitive gesture toward Peter and in a commanding voice that allowed no contradiction, he sternly said, "Stop, put those weapons away. Those who take up the sword will perish by the sword." Now it was his own followers who recoiled. And when Jesus saw that the immediate danger had passed, he turned to Peter and said, "Do you not understand that it is the Father's will that I drink this cup? And do you not know that even now more than 12 legions of angels are at my disposal? If I command them, they would free me from the hands of these few men." No ear was ever cut off from Malchus. Due to Jesus' prompt intervention, Peter's sword never came closer than 2 meters from him. The myth about the ear arose years later among the inhabitants of Jerusalem, celebrating Peter's hero status, and it has found its way into all 4 Gospels. If you doubt this, consider the following 4 things. 1. A very sharp sword is needed to precisely cut off a thin ear. It is highly unlikely that Peter had such a perfectly sharp sword. 2. If a sharp sword did cut off an ear, it would likely cause much more severe injuries. 3. If this had actually happened, it would have triggered a bloodbath. 4. If Peter had injured one of the temple guards, they certainly would not have tolerated him in their midst an hour later by the fire in the courtyard, where they were warming themselves together. Jesus indeed saved Malchus's earthly life, for he was entirely unprotected, and thereby also saved the lives of many others who might have fallen in battle. Although Jesus effectively put an end to physical resistance, this incident was enough for the captain to act swiftly. He quickly ordered 4 soldiers to roughly pull Jesus through their line so that they could bind him securely. As they tied his hands with a rope, Jesus said to them, "Why do you come here with swords and clubs as if to arrest a robber? I have been with you every day in the temple teaching the people openly, and you made no attempt to take me into custody then." Once Jesus was bound, the captain, fearing that the master's followers might attempt to rescue him, gave the order to disperse them or take them captive. However, the soldiers were not fast enough, as they all had already fled. All this time, John Mark had remained hidden in the shed, and he had seen and heard everything up close. When the soldiers started to leave with Jesus in their midst, John Mark wanted to follow them. But just then, one of the last soldiers, who had returned from chasing the fleeing disciples, came by, and when he saw the young man in his linen cloak, he immediately gave chase and almost caught him. He managed to grab hold of John's cloak, but the young man freed himself by slipping out of his garment, escaping naked, while the soldier was left holding the empty cloak. John Mark ran as fast as he could through the shallow ravine to the apostles' camp. Because the camp was about 150 meters further on the other side of a rock wall, David Zebedee, who was standing guard there at the time, had not noticed the arrest. However, he knew from his couriers that the soldiers were nearby, but he was still surprised when John ran up naked and told him the bad news. They then hurried to the tents of the sleeping apostles and informed all 8 of them that the Master had been betrayed and arrested. Around the time the 8 apostles were awakened, the other disciples returned, and they all gathered at the olive press to discuss what should be done. Meanwhile, Simon Peter and John Zebedee had regained their composure and, without communicating with each other, followed the band of soldiers who were now leading Jesus away as if he were a violent criminal. John followed the band closely, but Peter followed from a distance. After John Mark escaped from the soldiers' grasp, he put on a cloak he found in Simon Peter's tent. He guessed that the temple guards would take Jesus to the house of Annas, the emeritus high priest. This palace was at the top of the Mount of Olives, and he therefore took the shorter goat path that led straight up. His guess was correct, for shortly after he arrived at the high priest's palace, the soldiers arrived there with Jesus in their midst. John Mark hid near the main entrance, knowing he would not be allowed to enter through the gate.